Hello and welcome back to our weekly discussion of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. We're now at Perek Bet, Pasuk Yud Aleph, chapter 2, verse 11. And so we talked about the other weeks how Kohelet was doing an examination of lived experience, of our experience in the world, and examining various values and pursuits to see whether those provided adequate satisfaction and meaning in life. So things like wisdom and pleasures and living in the moment and the truth of this world, to what extent can pursuing those as a goal, as a pure goal, to what extent can they provide ultimate satisfaction? And Kohelet found those wanting ultimately, and where we left off, he was going to grab wisdom, intelligence, together with frivolity and foolishness and living in the moment, and to pursue both of those at the same time, pursuing each of them while not losing sight of the other, even though to some extent they're opposing goals. And he was going to do that to see whether those can live in mutual beneficial relationship and provide satisfaction, or perhaps one of those can be seen as more valuable than the other, or only one of those, but doing it while pursuing both at the same time and comparing them one to the other. And so that's where we left off, and we're now at verse 11. Ufanisi ani b'chal masai she'asu yadai, uve'amal she'amalti lasos, v'hine hakol havel ur'us ruach, ve'en yisron tachas hashamesh. And I look back at all the work that my hands produced, and at the efforts I expended to produce, and it turns out all is hevel and re'ut ruach. We discussed these terms previously. Just vanity, meaninglessness is hevel, and re'ut ruach is a broken desire, a desire that's frivolous and doesn't provide satisfaction. They are all hevel and re'ut ruach, and there is no advantage under the sun. So, in other words, he's talking now about what we discussed previously, pursuing pleasure using intelligence. And he had amassed all those pleasures that we discussed the prior week, 6 verses full of them. And ultimately, they provided some satisfaction, but not ultimate satisfaction. So a couple of plays and words and different things we can discuss in this sentence. Number 1, ufanisi, and I turned back. It's also and I faced. So the point here is he had experienced all these experiences, and now he's looking back and examining them. So the I that's standing after the experiences having been experienced is now examining those experiences. And that's why it says ufanisi, and I look back, ani, I. The I is double, because the I, that is the ego, or however you want to call it, the experiencer, the consciousness, the one that thinks, the person that thinks is looking back at the experiences that the person has experienced and examining the value and the pleasures and the repercussions of those experiences. So it's ufanisi ani, and I look back, the I look back. Another thing, the en yisron, there is no advantage under the sun. Under the sun is a motif. We mentioned this briefly, but I'll elaborate on it slightly. Under the sun is a motif for the worldly experiences. So everything that we experience under the sun. One way of thinking about it is, of course, everything we experience in the universe, at least until we traveled in space, everything was experienced under the sun. So, of course, it's at a very simple level, it's our experiences are under the sun, so it serves as a workable motif for all of our experiences in the world. But also, under the sun, there's something slightly more to that as well, because in ancient times, astronomers and scientists and chemistry and philosophers of ancient times looked at the world, the things in the world, the components of the world, as being composed of, depending on the system, whatever they were composed of, whether it's the 4 elements or other things, or atoms, depending on whatever the system was. But basically, in ancient times, up until the Middle Ages or the late Middle Ages, people thought that everything in this world under the orbit of the planets and the sun is made out of these worldly elements, but in the sun itself, the planets, and certainly the things on top of them, are more pure or more refined, are not the same elements, they're not the same chemicals, they're not the same things as here in the world. they're sort of more spiritual in a certain sense. So for that reason also, under the sun serves as a motif for our worldly and our material experiences that we experience in this world, as opposed to things that were perceived as being somewhat more spiritual. So a slight digression, but it's worth mentioning. That's part of what lies in the motif of under the sun, at least as it would have been considered and thought of in ancient times. So the point of all this being is that all of these pursuits of pleasure using intelligence ultimately were not really satisfying. They're not really the point of being, and they're not really providing ultimate satisfaction. There's something wanting, and there's some desire that's still left there that's not being fulfilled. Verse 12, Ufanisi ani liros chachma v'halelus v'sichlus, ki meh ha'adam sheyavo acharei hamelech, es asher kvar asuhu. And I turn to look at wisdom and frivolity and foolishness. For what is the person who can come following the king, what he has already done? So this is the outcome of this examination of wisdom and frivolity at the same time. And he's saying, and so I looked at both of these things, and who can do that better than the king? Of course, I, as the king who had all these experiences and had the ability to follow through on all of these different examinations, I am the one who is able to provide some sort of verdict or thoughtful position on these questions. There are slightly more complex ways to translate that last part of the sentence about I being the king, but I'm using the most simple explanation. So something that's actually worth pointing out, if you haven't already noticed it previously, Kohelet was written in such a way, and it's very interesting. It was written in such a way that there are many ways to translate words, word plays, portions of verses, verses themselves, and comparisons of verses one to the other. An example which we'll see in a moment. And I think it's all intentional. You can see from the way it was put together and the way all of these words and verses and statements work together and compare to each other, and the brevity of some of them, and how they play out one against the other. You can see that it was intentional. If you look at the commentaries, you'll see very often parts of a verse have very many ways of translating it. And even the words themselves, and certainly the meaning behind it and the point that's being made, and how the beginning of the verse leads into the end of it, and the end plays off of the beginning. Often you can have 5, 6, 8, 10 different ways of thinking, slight differences or more complex differences of playing with the verse and thinking about the meaning. And obviously there's no way to say that every single translation was intentional, but you can clearly see the way it was written, being the classic that it is, that a lot of it was intentional, and it was written in this poetic fashion to make you think and to make you work with the words and to make you pull the meaning out of working with the words and the thoughts in the sentences. And by doing so, you yourself have to be involved in reading the text. It doesn't feed it to you. It doesn't tell you this is the question and this is the answer. But you have to work with the question. You have to digest the question and think about it and understand what's being asked. And then you have to read the answer. As I mentioned in the introduction, it's a chida in a way. You have to work with the riddle and work through the answer and think about the words and think about how the answer is being put next to the question. And through that, understand the point that the author is working to make you think about. Well, on to the next verse. Pasuk Yud Gimel, verse 13. V'ra'isi ani, sheyesh yisron l'chachma min ha'sichlus, ki yisron ha'or min ha'chalshech. And I saw that there is an advantage to wisdom over folly, like the advantage of light over darkness. Beautiful sentence. What is this saying? So here the comparison comes to when he was discussing wisdom and intelligence in and of itself earlier. So earlier when he was talking about the value of wisdom as a value and as a pursuit in and of itself, he said, Berov chachma, rov ka'as. With the increase of wisdom comes an increase in vexation, an increase in negative experience. It's not always positive. So don't think that wisdom in and of itself is a goal. But here he's discussing wisdom as compared to foolishness. What are they worth, one compared to the other? And so here we're talking about using wisdom as a tool, and that's exactly what he's saying. Wisdom is not a value in and of itself. It's not a positive thing in and of itself. Yay, you're smart, you're wise, okay, great, you can understand certain things, but so what? That's not necessarily going to make you happier. but it's a valuable tool, just like light is a tool. The value in light is not in and of itself. Light doesn't give you anything, but light is an excellent and amazing tool to help you see things. Without light, you wouldn't be able to see anything. The same thing, wisdom and intelligence, it helps you do work. It helps you get to a goal. It helps you see obstacles. It helps you focus on things the correct way. It helps you build things the right way. So it helps you get to a positive goal, but it itself is not a positive goal. The benefit of intelligence is to the extent that it lights things up, like light. One other digression that's worth mentioning is one of the commenters mentions that Yisron l'chachma min ha'sichlus, ki Yisron ha'or min ha'chalshech. The advantage of wisdom comes from foolishness, just like the advantage of light comes in a certain sense from darkness. So it's a deeper thought, and I'm not going to go into it. It's not necessarily the purest, simplest way of reading the verse, but it is in there, and that is that if we would have wisdom alone, if everybody would be equally wise, then wisdom itself would not have the value that it has. The value in wisdom is that it stands next to foolishness. And you have foolishness and you have wisdom at the same time. And you can use wisdom to extricate from foolishness. Just like light, the value of light comes from the darkness in a certain sense. Because if everything would always be equally lit up, the light itself would just be there. It would just be something that exists and taken for granted. But the real value of light comes from the fact that darkness is the absence of light. And so to the extent that darkness is there, light is not there. To the extent that light is there, darkness is not there. And so the less darkness, the more light, and vice versa. And the value of light comes from the fact that it's the opposite of darkness. So food for thought and something interesting to think about, and that's in there in the verse 2, although you can read it in a much simpler way as well. Well, on to verse 14, Yodalet. Hachacham einav birosho, v'haksil b'choshech holech, v'yadati gam ani, shemikra echad yikra es kulam. The wise, his eyes are ahead, and the fool in darkness goes. And I also realized that one and the same occurrences will happen to both. So we can unpack this too. The beginning of it, Hechacham einav birosho, the wise person, his eyes are in his head. A couple of different ways of reading that, all really saying the same thing, but different plays on words. His eyes are birosho, in his head. He actually has eyes. He's looking ahead, while the fool is walking in darkness and not seeing the obstacles and not seeing the road ahead and not focusing and not working towards the goal. The other way is Hechacham einav birosho, kind of like in English. He's thinking ahead. Not sure it works exactly the same in Hebrew, but it may work slightly similarly. So he's thinking ahead. It's not literally his eyes are in his head, but he's thinking ahead. Another way of reading the same thing is Hechacham einav birosho. The wise person, his eyes are at the beginning. In Hebrew, birosho means at the beginning. So at the beginning, his eyes are already there thinking about the future, whereas the fool is not doing that. At the beginning, he's just in the moment, and therefore he's missing at the beginning what's coming at the end, and so he's losing out. So different ways of reading Hechacham einav birosho, but the idea is the same. The wise, smart, intelligent person is thinking ahead. That's the point of thought and intelligence, whereas the fool is just living in the moment. And so wisdom is a tool to help you and help you get ahead. However, I also realized, even though I realized that wisdom has this advantage, I also realized that the same occurrences happen to both. And so that's the flip side of this. Yes, there's a benefit, but at the end of the day, and here again, we have a few different ways of reading this, and they're all equally true and play off against each other. Yes, the wise person has the benefit, and that benefit is that he's able to read the occurrences that happen equally to everybody. So yes, the same occurrences to some extent happen to everybody. Everybody is victim of the random occurrences, the things that happen to everybody. Everybody can get into accidents. Everybody has different variations of luck. Everybody has some success and some failures. Everybody has some things that work out and don't work out. But wisdom can help you work with those things. It can help you see ahead and look ahead at those things. That's one way of reading this. But the other side is the flip side, which is that, yes, the wise person is able to do all of these things, but at the end of the day, Nothing's perfect for anybody. So yes, you can plan ahead as much as you want, but you can still be in an accident and things can still happen. And ultimately the same occurrences or similar occurrences will happen to both people. So at the end of the day, is it really that much better? What's really the point? So that's the second way of reading the end of the sentence. And the third way is, of course, Mikra echad yikra es kulam, the same occurrence happens to both, and we're talking about that. Ultimately, both of them end up in the hole. So what's the difference? I have a great life and I'm so smart and I'm thinking ahead and I'm doing all these things and I'm getting everything right, but am I really so much better off than the fool? We're both going to end up in the same place, underground. Moving on to Pasuk Tesvav, 15. V'amarti ani belibi, k'mikre haksil gam ani yikreni, v'lama chakamti ani az yoser, v'dibarti v'libi shegam ze havel. And I spoke in my heart, like the occurrence of the fool, will occur to me too, meaning to me who I'm thinking, right? He's the chacham because he kept wisdom at the same time. So I spoke in my heart, like the occurrence of the fool will occur to me too. So then, for what? Why did I wise up more? And I said to myself that this too is hevel, foolish meaninglessness. In other words, the wisdom and the thinking and all of these things that I did, ultimately, I'm going to end up in the same place as the fool. So what's the point? Ultimately, is there really a real value and real satisfaction in all of this if we all end up under the ground anyhow? What's really the point? Ki ein zichron lechacham im haksil le'olam, b'shekvar hayamim haba'im hakol nishkach, ve'ech yamus hechacham im haksil. For there is no memory to the wise with the fool forever. What with the passing of coming days all is forgotten. And how shall the wise die with the fool? In other words, ultimately we're all in the same boat. Both the wise and the foolish, we all reach the same place at the end. Maybe some of us get there a little bit faster or slower, but we all end up in the same place. So ultimately, what's the point really after all? There's also some interesting ways that the sentence can be turned around to read that the wise and the fool are not ultimately the same, even after death, which are different ways of reading the verse. I won't get into them, but the way I read it is, at least to me, the way I think of it, is the simplest, most straightforward way of reading the verse. And that brings us to the end of these verses and this lecture and this presentation. I hope you enjoyed, and come back next week for the follow-up.